Hey everyone, it's Jen with Spirited Saturdays, and this week we are wrapping up our rotation on crisis and eating disorders, and we're talking about PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder as it pertains to eating disorder recovery and what happens when something critical happens, and you might look to your eating disorder as a way to cope with that. So basically what this means for me, the way I see this, is that if you're going through a situation, a critical moment, a crisis moment, where it really is a matter of survival. In that moment, you might not be thinking about the eating disorder. You might be thinking just about surviving in that moment, and that can range from any, that covers any kind of crisis, whether, I know we were talking about communal crises, it could cover that, it could cover, I'm choking, individual crises, it could cover any kind of trauma, and where in that moment you feel like you're fighting for your survival. And it could be also your psychological survival in some cases too, or in many cases. And almost also there's like brainwashing. There's things that go on where you're really fighting to keep who you are. Thinking cults, things like that. I don't know what possibly applies to your viewers, but just kind of thinking of all the possible situations that can cause you to feel like you have to fight to survive physically and emotionally and keep yourself and hang on to that however you could. So once that moment is over, or that event, or that series of events, and you are maybe physically freer, it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that you stopped having an eating disorder during the crisis. And the eating disorder might be your default way of coping. Also, an event like that could trigger the onset of an eating disorder if you're vulnerable to developing one. So I want to talk about continuing to feed yourself in order to survive, just in the way you tried to survive when you were going on in the crisis, when the crisis was going on. So when the crisis is over, you still need to be in survival mode, because you might be tempted to resort to a destructive mode, because maybe your personal safety isn't threatened in that moment and it doesn't seem as urgent to protect yourself. So the old patterns might set in, or new ones might develop that are unhealthy. But I was thinking about it, and I think that we need to look at the choice that we have. We could either feed the eating disorder, or we could feed ourselves. And which one of those choices is going to make for the best chances of recovery and developing strength after a crisis, and keeping strong after a crisis, and being able to handle coping with the aftermath of a crisis. Because when the crisis is over, if you fall into the eating disorder, there will be no coping with the crisis directly. Now there first has to be coping with or resolving the eating disorder, which makes perfect sense. It makes sense that that's why somebody would go there, because they don't want to think about the crisis. That's too scary. And for all its worries and fears, the eating disorder feels safer. So that's a place to go, because every single part of it is predictable. And it's like developing the behaviors, doing the behaviors, having all of the thoughts and all of the feelings that come along with them, allow a person to avoid something harder or something different. And on top of that, the resolving of the eating disorder. Also, once you have the behaviors, you have to resolve it. You don't have to, but it feels like then that becomes an urgency. So the healthy thing to do would be to resolve it, to focus on it in order to resolve it. And there you go. That's the new issue. That is the primary issue now. So you have successfully avoided what's actually going on. And I mean, I've done this. And I understand. And it takes a lot to admit that. Because it's not as though you're choosing to use the symptoms. But once you realize that you're headed there, you can choose to turn it around. Let me say that again. It's not as though you're choosing to have the urge to use behaviors. That is not a choice. You don't decide to want to do a behavior. You don't decide to have the feeling that prompted that urge. But at some point it does become a choice of whether or not to engage your thoughts or engage the healthier part of you that's fighting, just like the part of you that was fighting to survive in that critical moment. So there is perhaps in that moment what seems to be the easier choice, and there is the harder choice. Imagine you have a hole where soil goes in, and you could feed it with the eating disorder soil, or you could feed it with your soil. Or maybe you have two and you have one soil, and the soil can go into the eating disorder one, or it can go into the healthy one and nurture that or nourish that. And picking the healthy soil might be a more difficult choice, but it is more sustainable. And so, because if you went through something that was very difficult, where you were fighting for your life, that is going to cause all sorts of feelings and other kinds of symptoms, maybe, that you just don't even want to touch. You don't even want to go there. So this is more accessible. But underneath this, that's still raging. It's still there, vying for attention and resolve. And there's a reason people resort to eating disorders, because it provides a very convenient disconnect. And if you didn't have the symptoms, you might be feeling something far more uncomfortable. But a lot of the crises that go on that make people want to or feel the need to resort to behaviors are laden with messages of undeservingness, or somehow can make a person feel like they're not worth addressing those issues. They're not worth it. They're not justified in how they feel. It could be many things, and the eating disorder is right there to let you know that you aren't worth it. So you've got to redirect and address what's going on and address any kind of block that's preventing you from connecting to it directly. But when you do connect to it directly, make sure you do that in a safe environment and take it slow. If you need to, take it at your own pace. Just because you say, I'm not going to use the eating disorder, doesn't mean you have to dive headfirst into the thing that scares you the most. You can do it at your own pace with help, guided. So, I guess that's it. I know we all kind of did our own versions of this topic, so I suggest checking out the other videos from the other women and seeing what they all have to say. So, yeah, if you haven't already. So, okay, see you next week and be safe.